First of all, thank you all for being here today. I would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, the Tiemens Foundation and the Richard Petritz Foundation. I'd also like to recognize our institutional members, the United States Air Force Academy Political Science Department, UCCS, Pikes Peak State College, SEVA Charter School, Fountain Valley School, and the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC. Just a general announcement, we don't have the specifics yet, but we do have our spring program is coming up and shaping up very nicely. I will be sending out a full calendar, hopefully within the next month or so. I believe our first program will be January 12th, and we're moving on from there. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Thank you to Erin Kuhn for being with us today. Erin took up her posting as Consul of Government and Prosperity Affairs at the UK Government Office in Denver in December of 2015. She was previously Chief of Staff for Global Programs and University Life at New York University, where she helped to expand NYU's global footprint to 14 campuses worldwide and position NYU as a leading institution in international education. Immediately prior to that role, Erin worked as a consultant for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, focusing on global communications and advocacy efforts to eradicate polio and, more broadly, to promote the delivery of life-saving vaccines to children around the world. She began her career at the U.S. Department of State, where she held several roles within the Bureau of International Organization Affairs in Washington, D.C., and at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, including serving as the lead officer for Middle East Affairs at the United Nations and as the department's liaison to Congress on issues related to international organizations. She holds a BA in International Relations from the University of Southern California and an MA in International Affairs from the George Washington University. She has also studied Arabic at Georgetown University and at the American University in Cairo. Please help me to welcome Erin Kuhn.
We'll find out. Can you guys all hear me? Yes. Okay, great, good. Well, Karen, thank you so much for that introduction. I have to say, it's so wonderful to be here. I don't get down to Colorado Springs nearly as much as I'd like to, and it's such a beautiful and wonderful part of the state. And as I was coming up to this location, I realized I'd actually been here for a wedding before. But this looks familiar. So like I said, it's great to be here, and Karen, thanks for those kind words. As she mentioned, I serve as the British Consul for Colorado, which means I oversee the UK's relationship with this beautiful, wonderful, great state. I think I have one of the best jobs in the world, actually. I can tell you a little bit about what it means to be the British Consul, but the first thing I'll tell you about is what it doesn't mean. There are a few things I don't do. I don't get naughty Brits out of jail. I don't do passports and visas. I have some very capable colleagues around the US who do that kind of work. I get to focus on the fun bits, which is the UK's business relationship with Colorado. So I do a lot of work helping Colorado companies expand into the UK, and vice versa, helping British companies expand over here to Colorado and help contribute to the economy locally. I do our more kind of traditional diplomacy work, kind of more political diplomacy, so building and strengthening relationships with Colorado's political leadership, whether that's at sort of the governor's level or mayoral level or state legislature or city councils. We work across the kind of the full sort of political spectrum. And then the third part of what I do is help build and foster scientific and innovation ties between Colorado and the UK. I don't have to tell all of you, you'll know, but there is an incredibly robust and incredibly active kind of innovation ecosystem here in Colorado that's really supported by the Federal Laboratory Network here, and we really take advantage of that and leverage that and try and foster more connections between the UK and Colorado on a variety of different levels, and I'll speak more about that as I go along. I will say from the get-go that I don't want to talk for too long. I really want this to be more of a dialogue and a conversation and a discussion, so please throw any comments or questions my way at the end. I really look forward to that part of this engagement. But I'll do just a few kind of background, scene-setting comments about the US-UK relationship, and then we can kind of go into a conversation from there. But let me start by talking broadly about what we call the special relationship, which is a phrase that Winston Churchill coined back in 1945 to kind of describe Anglo-American ties. So you might be asking yourself, what makes this relationship so quote-unquote special? I would say there's a number of different things. From kind of an overarching perspective, the US and the UK are natural, resilient, and strong allies and partners. We've got common interests, we tackle common and shared objectives and challenges, and we have, of course, close linguistic, historical, cultural, political ties. But I would say one of the things that's really at the foundation of this special relationship is the fact that we have shared values. So it's shared values around freedom, freedom of speech, shared values around openness, open markets, open governance, and shared values around things like tolerance and equality. And because we have these shared values and because we have this strong foundation, we are able to do more together than any two countries in the world by far and away. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the pillars of the special relationship. Again, what makes this relationship so special. So I'm going to start with kind of talking about the defense relationship. I want to start with defense because I know Colorado Springs is not only one of the defense capitals of Colorado, or the defense capital of Colorado, but it's one of the defense capitals of the United States. So it's a key part of the economy and the community here. So I would say, if you go all the way back to World War II and then kind of up into today's conflicts, whether it's fighting ISIL and Daesh or, responding to Russian aggression, the UK has consistently been the historic partner of choice for the US when it comes to fighting democracy and establishing global security. This US-UK defense partnership has been the bedrock of, again, international security for 7-8 decades or so, maybe longer. We are close allies in NATO. We are both permanent members of the UN Security Council. We are leading nuclear powers. And so this partnership is really vital and really important to establishing and maintaining international peace and security. If we look at kind of the 20th century, it was instrumental, of course, in facing down fascism and winning the Cold War. And now, since the end of the Cold War, the US and UK armed forces have fought together in Iraq, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Libya. And I think it's important to mention that obviously our troops fight together, but in peacetime our troops train and equip and recuperate together as well. We have hundreds of UK military personnel stationed around the US, including a number that are stationed here in Colorado, and I can talk about that a little bit later as well. Beyond armed forces, we have a close working relationship when it comes to law enforcement and sharing best practice there as well. We have a close relationship around nuclear power. And of course, we share intelligence and technology in a way that we do not share with any other country in the world. I think I would also say that the US and the UK have very sort of like-minded and shared objectives around defense spending. So the UK spends more on defense than any other country in the European Union. We are one of only a handful of countries in NATO that meet the 2% of GDP on defense spending, and we've pledged to do that for the next decade. UK capability, much like US capability, remains one of the most advanced in the world, and again, the UK is investing heavily in these assets as well in terms of modernizing its armed forces. There's a focus on investing in new strike fighters, surveillance aircraft, cyber defenses, submarines, aircraft carriers, armored vehicles, sort of you name it. And I think the UK has planned to invest about $220 billion again over the next decade in these assets. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the other UK personnel that are stationed around the world, because it's in addition to our armed forces. We have our diplomats, which is the network that I'm a part of. Our Foreign Development and Commonwealth Office, which is the UK's equivalent of the State Department, employs over 14,000 people worldwide in nearly 270 diplomatic posts. So these are embassies, consulates, missions to multilateral organizations. And here in the US, we have representation in 13 cities, including in Denver, where I represent the UK. So that's a little bit about sort of the defense pillar of the special relationship. Another important aspect of the special relationship is the economic and business ties. I'll give you a few facts and figures to kind of paint this picture, but just to start off by saying the UK is the US's largest trading partner. Our trade relationship is worth over $250 billion annually. We are also each other's biggest investors. We invest about $1 trillion in one another's economies, and the US is the largest destination for UK foreign investment. So about 25% of UK foreign investment comes here to the United States, which is really, really significant. I want to talk a little bit about jobs because everybody cares about jobs. UK companies support more jobs in the US than any other country in the world, by far and away. British companies employ about 1.2 million Americans, and the same is true on the other side of the pond, as we would say it, in the UK as well. So every morning, about 1 million Brits go to work for American companies. So that's all to say that our economies are incredibly interlinked, incredibly interdependent, and both growing and both very strong. In terms of kind of our economic relationship, we've done a lot of work to remove trade barriers over the past couple of years. You've probably seen in the news, we've removed barriers around steel and aluminum, or aluminium, as my British colleagues like to say. That word never rolls off my tongue. We've done a lot on the Airbus-Boeing dispute, and we've also overturned the US ban on certain agricultural products like UK beef and lamb. And this is something that will only boost the economic relationship going forward. I mean, I think we've seen trade wars are difficult, they don't help anybody, and when we can remove these trade irritants or these trade barriers, it works in everybody's favor. In addition to kind of relieving these trade barriers, one of the things that the UK and the US have been pursuing is a free trade agreement. So it might surprise people that the US and the UK have never had a free trade agreement before. This is important to the fact that prior to Brexit, which is the UK's exit from the European Union, the UK was a party to EU trade policy. So any free trade agreements that the UK wanted to be a part of had to be negotiated as part of the EU bloc. When the UK exited the EU, they were able to pursue their own independent unilateral trade policy, and of course a free trade agreement with the US was top of list because of the important trade relationship that I outlined before. And so starting in the Trump administration, the UK worked with USTR, which is the US's Office of the Trade Representative, to start negotiations on a trade agreement. And we went through several rounds, which was kind of amazing because for those of you that might follow trade agreement negotiations, these things tend to be lengthy, they take years, and we were able to go through several rounds of negotiations very quickly. Especially considering the fact that so much of those negotiations had to be virtual, right? It was happening in COVID, and people are used to sort of being locked in a room and forced to work things out, and we had to figure out how to do that in a more virtual context, and we found that it actually worked quite well. So we were able to advance negotiations to a pretty good place, and then when the Biden administration came in, negotiations stalled a little bit, and this was due to the fact that I think there were a lot of other things going on in the world, a lot of different priorities to look at, recovering from the pandemic, focusing on economic stability. So while kind of free trade agreement negotiations are paused at the moment, that doesn't mean that we're not doing anything around trade barriers or looking at ways to further strengthen trade relationships. Right now, there's a lot of focus on US-UK collaboration around supporting SMEs. So that's this small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the lifeblood of both of our economies, and that's absolutely true here in Colorado as well. So we're working together to look at opportunities for SMEs to get involved in emerging technologies, looking how SMEs can, contribute to the post-pandemic recovery. And we're also, I think most importantly, looking at ways that we can work together to increase access to capital for both SMEs and startups on both sides of the Atlantic. But in addition to this work around SMEs, we are also looking at a number of different shared objectives. These are things around, building resilience in supply chains, addressing the global impact of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and the rising energy prices that are a result of that, promoting environmental protection and the transition to net zero, supporting high labor and environmental standards. This is a real strong priority for the USTR, and it's something that the UK believes in as well, that trade should work for everyone, no matter where you fall in the socioeconomic spectrum, that trade should benefit all. So again, working on high labor and environmental standards for that, and then promoting innovation and inclusive growth. We're also looking at, what are some of the high growth areas that we can work together on, and these are things like digital, where it's a real asset for both the UK and the United States. So that's a little bit about the economic relationship. Another key pillar is around science and innovation and research. I think we all know the US and the UK are world-leading nations when it comes to science, research, innovation. Both countries invest heavily in this area, and together they produce some of the most impactful research in the world. They're actually ranked first and second, respectively, in terms of global research citations. The US and the UK have a long history of collaboration across every discipline of knowledge. Almost 20% of papers published by UK researchers also include an American co-author. I think that's a great statistic just to underline that academic and research collaboration. And another favorite stat to throw out is US and UK collaborations have resulted in 26 Nobel Prizes awarded jointly between researchers in these two countries. I would say this aspect of our special relationship is so important to the UK that we have an entire network of officers stationed here in the US that are devoted exclusively to working with laboratories, universities, other research organizations to further these collaborations, because we really see the fruits of this work. I would say in terms of areas that the UK is most interested in terms of research and innovation, we look at emerging technologies, things around AI and the data economy, kind of the future of mobility, so electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles, autonomous vehicles. We're really interested in collaboration in those areas. Clean growth, I'll talk a little bit about our climate policy in a second. And then aging society, that's a demographic that's growing very quickly in the UK, and it's one that we need to adapt to. And I think there are a lot of technological and innovative solutions that we're exploring to supporting that community as well. So that's a little bit about kind of the overarching US-UK relationship, but I want to dial it down a little bit to what does that mean for Colorado. And I think Colorado is a great model of the special relationship at play. I mean, you really have to look no further than the UK's relationship to this state to see all of these different pillars very active. So first off, the UK is by far and away the largest foreign direct investor in this state. I love my Canadian and Mexican colleagues. They are the distant 2 and 3 in terms of investors in the state, but really there's no other country that comes even close to the number of British companies that we have here. There's over 200 British subsidiaries in Colorado. They employ around 22,000 Coloradans, and that number just continues to grow. And I think it's really interesting because these investors or these companies that have come over and expanded into Colorado are very cross-sectoral in nature. They are not focused on one particular industry or sector. They really mirror the diversity of Colorado's economy. Just to give you a few names of British companies that are here that you might know of, we've got BAE Systems, which is a British defense company, IHS Markit, which is a financial services company, Reaction Engines, a really innovative space company, Cobham, another defense company, Speechmatics, BP, British Petroleum, energy company. All of these have major investments in Colorado. And then we see the investments happening in the other direction as well. So we see Colorado companies expanding into the UK at a rapid clip. So every Fortune 500 company in Colorado has a UK presence. But beyond that, we see companies that are looking to expand globally for the first time, that the UK becomes their first port of call. And I think we see this for a lot of reasons. I mean, there's sort of shared language, there's a shared business culture, there's a shared value of transparency, there's strong labor markets. And so again, companies in Colorado that are homegrown, that are thinking, hey, we need an office globally to meet our customer requirements, the UK is usually the first place that they look at. And so again, we have companies like Aero Electronics, Colorado's largest company with major presence in the UK, Liberty Global, DaVita, Techstars, Palantir. I mean, the list can go on of Colorado companies that are invested in the UK. On the trade side, the UK is a top 3 market for Colorado goods and services, and these exports supported an additional 10,000 jobs in the state. In terms of trade, I would say the UK market is much heavier on services than goods, so a lot of the trade is in things like financial and management services, travel, those types of things as well. I should also mention that London and Denver have actually even formalized a city-to-city partnership that will help build these trade and investment pipelines. So it allows British companies that want to kind of test out the waters in Colorado to come over here and have a soft landing. So they are offered office space and access to networking events and community, and the same happens in London when Colorado companies want to go out and test that space as well. So we have a really strong relationship there. But there's more to kind of the Colorado-UK relationship than just business ties. There's strong policy and research collaborations as well. around things like renewable energy, smart cities technologies, cybersecurity, space. The list again goes on and on. Just to give you a couple of examples, we work very closely with the National Renewable Energy Lab. You might know of it as NREL. We do a lot of work around battery storage, which is a kind of a challenge that both the US and the UK are trying to tackle. We also get very involved in the International Space Symposium, which takes place here at the Broadmoor. I usually get to camp out here for a week every spring and hang out at the Broadmoor while we work with our US counterparts to kind of explore both commercial and military space opportunities. And we tend to bring out a pretty large delegation for Space Symposium. I mean, up to 100 people, whether it's representatives from private companies, whether it's sort of policy officials, or whether it's members of our armed forces that come out here for that particular engagement. And that kind of brings me, again, to the strong defense ties that the UK has with Colorado. We have a number of British officers that are stationed here, both as embedded and liaison officers. They are at Buckley Air Force Base up in Aurora, but actually the vast majority of them are down here in Peterson, and they are working as liaisons to NORAD and Northern Command, as well as working in Space Command. And I was speaking about this earlier, but I work with these officers. They're all from the Royal Air Force, and they tell me that they actually love coming to Colorado, not just because Colorado is a great place to be, and who doesn't love being down here, but because they learn so much. The US does have a more advanced military capability when it comes to space, and these officers come and they're stationed alongside their counterparts in the US military, and they really learn and they really forge connections. And I think it's a really great just model for what the special relationship looks like on a day-to-day basis. We also have incredible tourism links, and I know probably a number of you in the room have taken advantage of these. Denver International Airport has non-stop service between Denver and London daily. In the summer, it ramps up to twice daily. We've got a number of different carriers that are serving the London market as well. BA, British Airways, has been serving the Denver market for over 25 years. So, and as a result, London is Denver International Airport's biggest long-haul market. So again, we've got those great transportation and connectivity ties that allow British tourists to come over here to Denver, to the mountains, to the springs, and stay in our hotels here, dine at our restaurants, enjoy our outdoor recreation, and ultimately really contribute to the Colorado economy. So I would say, kind of in summary, that Colorado is really, a microcosm of the wider US-UK special relationship. I'll just mention a few things on climate and climate change and climate action, because this is an incredibly high priority for the British government. Some of you may have known this, but last year the UK hosted something called COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. COP is an acronym for the Conference of Parties. It is the UN's biggest climate conference every year, and the UK hosted it last year, which is really a signal of its commitment to tackling climate change. We've seen considerable progress on climate and climate action over the years, but I think the British government's perspective is that more needs to be done. So they used COP26 as a way to kind of increase global ambition even further around the key agreements of the Paris Agreement, which is kind of the bedrock of global climate policy. So we looked at things like mitigation, adaptation, climate finance. And we really see a lot of benefit to tackling climate change. It results in cleaner air, healthier communities, more sustainable economic growth, energy security, which I think, again, everybody is looking at right now given what's happening in Ukraine, and ultimately a safer and more stable climate. But to do this, we really have to meet, the pillars of the Paris Agreement. We have to move quicker than ever. In fact, what we found is that we need to decarbonize the global economy 3 to 5 times faster than we've been doing over the next decade. So COP26, again, which the UK hosted, really sought to get countries, subnationals, businesses, and other stakeholders to work together to achieve these goals, because climate is one of these transnational issues, right? We're not going to solve it unless we work together as a global community. The UK has committed to net zero by 2050. That's a result of its commitment at COP26. It's also got 90% of other countries around the world to make those climate commitments, including the United States. UK is also committed to promoting more green technologies and exporting them around the world, and really ultimately kind of looking at what a clean and green recovery from the pandemic can look like. And I think finally, the war in Ukraine has reminded all of us how sensitive we are to changes in energy prices. And I think the lesson that the UK has taken from this is that we need to invest more in renewable energy and clean energy, and that can only be done in working in partnership with countries like the United States that has a really robust renewable energy economy and really robust expertise in this area. The last thing I'll say before I kind of open it up for more of a conversation is Karen had wanted me to talk a little bit about British domestic politics. Unfortunately, what I will say is I have no salacious political gossip to share. I'm a diplomat, so I can't really comment on domestic politics. I serve the British government no matter what political party is in power and no matter who is the Prime Minister. But what I will say is that it's been an incredibly interesting time in British politics. It's been an incredibly interesting time to be in my role. Today actually is my 7-year anniversary in this job. I started in this job December 1st, 2015. And in those 7 years, I've seen 5 British prime ministers, which is quite a lot of transition and a bit of churn. Also during my tenure in this role, the UK made the kind of landmark and historic decision to leave the EU, which had a lot of political consequences as well. But as many of you will know, the UK has recently welcomed a new prime minister back in October, Rishi Sunak. He is a member of the Conservative Party. He's been an MP or member of Parliament, kind of like a representative to Congress since 2015. He's thought to be pretty centrist in terms of his political orientation, less sort of ideologically motivated. He regards the US in an incredibly positive light, so I think his prime ministership is going to mean really good things for the relationship with the US. He went to Stanford on a Fulbright scholarship. He met his wife there. He's very familiar with the US, with American culture, and regards it in an incredibly positive light. So I foresee him having really strong relationships with the White House, with the president and his cabinet. And so I think his prime ministership will mean really good things for the special relationship. Previously, he served as the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Boris Johnson's government, meaning that he was head of the Treasury, so he oversaw all economic and financial policy, which I think is a really good background for somebody in the prime ministership to have, particularly at this moment. He's got a strong hold of economic policy and really focused on establishing global economic stability. So what I will say is that while there have been many sort of transitions and twists and turns in British politics and in foreign policy over the past several years, there's a strong focus at the moment on establishing stability, on recovering from the effects of the pandemic, on tackling the recession and inflation, which I think countries around the world are experiencing right now. And I think most importantly, continuing to play a strong leadership role in the global community, whether that's strengthening bilateral relationships with key allies like the US, or whether it's continuing to maintain a really strong leadership role in multilateral organizations, whether it be the UN or the WTO. I think that's what we'll see out of his prime ministership, and I think that's what we'll see out of UK foreign policy going forward. So I'll stop there. I know that's a mouthful. I kind of did a round robin of a number of different issues just to give us some background, but I'm really happy to field any questions you have, field any comments you have. I'm really kind of at your disposal. But thank you for listening and thanks for having me here.
So I have the microphone. If you'll just raise your hand and I can bring it over to you.
Well, globalism is under attack here in the United States, as you know. One side attacking it more vigorously than the other. But, and The Economist tells me that England, maybe all of Great Britain, is in recession, and then they had Brexit before that. I wonder from your position out here at the end of the spear, are all of these connections that you mentioned on the increase, or are they suffering?
No, it's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think the global community is in a period of turmoil right now. I think, again, energy prices as a result of Russia's aggression in Ukraine are destabilizing things. I think the pandemic has been difficult as well. But what I think we've seen from the UK, both in terms of its relationship with the US and with the global community, is a desire to do more together, a desire to kind of work more closely again, whether it's bilaterally or multilaterally, to solve some of these challenges, because they're not going to go away by just one country trying to do it unilaterally. They really require kind of a multilateral solution. So I think we are going to see the UK be even more engaged in the UN, especially in tackling some of the things around Russia. I mean, we've enacted some of the most aggressive sanctions that the UK has ever enacted against both individuals and entities in Russia. I think in terms of tackling climate change, obviously working multilaterally is going to be the solution. And I think in terms of tackling global health, I mean, I think the pandemic showed us again that these are issues that are transnational in nature. They don't stay in one border, they don't stay in one country, and we need to come together as a global community. So I think the theme is going to be collaboration, multilateralism, and to your question of whether these partnerships are increasing or decreasing, I think they have no choice but to increase, because I think we have to work together to tackle them.
Well, in your opinion, you're working closely with colleagues from the UK and doing practical things. Is your view that Brexit is a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's been a while, it's working. So.
Yeah. You're asking me the million-dollar question. Diplomats are never able to give their opinions. But what I would say is Brexit was a momentous and landmark and historic decision. Nobody had ever really left the EU before, except for Greenland, I think in the 80s, and nothing against Greenland, but their economy is much different than the UK's. The UK is the 5th largest economy in the world. So it's a much more complex process for the UK to leave the EU. And it was a very politically polarizing decision, right? I mean, you know, when the referendum was had back in June 2016, there were people that felt very strongly and passionately on both sides of the issue, whether it was to remain or to leave. Ultimately, the way the vote went, it was 52% to leave, 48% to remain, which is, you know, pretty close. And I think after we saw that vote and after the decision had been made, and, you know, there was some political turmoil that happened because then Prime Minister David Cameron immediately resigned and we had to find, you know, get a new Prime Minister. So I think to the global community, things felt relatively unstable in the UK during that time, which of course made my job real easy. And, you know, news outlets were reporting that, you know, the UK has jumped off a cliff, the economy is going to tank, UK is no longer relevant in sort of the global power share. And I think what we saw, and I would say this whether or not I'm wearing my diplomatic hat, I think what we saw was things weren't even remotely as bad as was predicted, right? The British economy is so fundamentally strong. Again, like I said, it's the 5th largest economy in the world, the 2nd largest economy in the EU, second only to Germany. And so it's got such fundamental strength and such leverage that even though leaving the EU was a major and complex decision, I think the fallout wasn't nearly what everybody thought it would be. Then, of course, we had the global pandemic hit us, right? And that affected everybody's economy. So it's hard to kind of determine what's an effect of COVID and the pandemic, what's an effect of Brexit. But I think we haven't really seen the UK dip or have any negative issues in the way that was predicted. So whether or not Brexit is a good or bad thing, I'm not sure I can actually give a black or white answer to that. But what I will say is that the impacts of it haven't been nearly as negative as was predicted. And from a very kind of anecdotal and local perspective, we still see a steady stream of Colorado companies wanting to invest in the UK. I mean, when you look at like financial markets, there's no other hub in the world besides New York that comes close to being the financial capital that London does, and no other city will. Again, you know, we have the UK is such a strong business climate, such a just strong transparency and labor laws that it's just a natural place for companies to want to expand to. So I don't know. Like I said, I would say that it hasn't been nearly as bad as anybody predicted.
Just a little bit different question on the Brexit. London has long been known as a financial center for the world. Has Brexit changed that much? the international banking system that's centered or not centered there now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think once Brexit happened, I think some of the sectors that were most concerned were in the financial services, right? Because they were used to something called passporting. I don't know if some of you are familiar with that, that kind of phrase, but what it means is that a financial company like Goldman Sachs or something, take them for example, could establish themselves in London and then easily work without having to get permits or licenses or other things in all of the other EU countries. When Brexit happened and the UK was removing itself from the EU, those companies in that sector got a little nervous because they wondered, what does that mean? Do I have to now get specific licenses? If I'm headquartered in London, do I need to get specific licenses if I want to be in France and Italy and Germany? And so I think what we saw happen is, and again, this kind of goes back to the theme of it wasn't nearly as bad as what people were thinking. There was a prediction that the financial services companies were just going to, in mass exodus, leave London. But the truth is like I said before, there's no other city that comes even close to the expertise or the assets that London has. So what I think we saw is most companies continuing to keep their headquarters there and keep a decent amount of their team there, and then set up a smaller office in, let's say, Paris or another city. So yes, some of those companies may have expanded into other European countries, but it didn't mean that they left London again in mass. It just meant that they expanded into other areas a little bit more. So to answer your question, no, I mean, we haven't seen any change in terms of London's status as one of the global, financial capitals of the world.
I'm going to stay seated because of my bad knees, but I don't know if you'll answer this or not, but I'm curious about, with all the political unrest in America and the schisms and the rise in white nationalism and certainly the investigations going on related to January 6th and all the political tensions in this country, how does Great Britain look at the stability of even wanting to work with us in certain ways or trusting us right now at this point in history and being a stable partner in things that need to happen?
It's a great question, and as I alluded to, British politics has had its own twists and turns as well, so I think we are absolutely bedfellows in that. I think there are a couple of ways to look at your question. I think first is that Brits love to follow American politics. They watch and they follow domestic politics here very closely in the same way that Americans like to be observers of British politics. So I think there's been a real focus on what's happening in the US and actually a real desire to learn and to share best practice because some of these challenges are shared, right? You mentioned, countering violent extremism and white nationalism. That is a shared challenge, right? That happens in the UK as well. And we actually have some really strong connections with the FBI and other organizations that deal with this to figure out how can we learn from one another. We're also trying to learn from one another around inclusivity and equality, and both countries have had issues around this and making sure that everybody is treated equal. So I think we're trying to learn from one another on one end. I think on the other end, and I was mentioning this to this table before, is that one of the really amazing things about the special relationship is that it rises above politics, it rises above leaders. So no matter what political party is in power in the UK or in the US, no matter who's in the White House or in number 10, that special relationship has such a strong foundation and such a strong history that we will continue to work together. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be points of divergence. There have been over the years, but for the most part, we are allies, we are friends, and again, our values align. So even when things domestically can feel slightly unstable or can feel a little difficult, we are always going to work together as allies and partners.
So thank you. Earlier, you mentioned about the defense and the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K., and of course with some of the troops that are residing right here in Colorado Springs, which I've had the pleasure of working side by side with, so some of the best troops I've ever worked with. With that being said, of course here, we like to call it the space mecca of the world. What we are noticing with a more contested and congested space environment, there's a lot of things going on with our adversaries up there.
Yeah.
With that being said, the UN just recently passed a resolution basically, I won't say banning, but really putting a frown on anti-satellite testing and so forth. With that being said, we are trying here in the US to build norms of behavior for space operations. But right now, no one country is still taking that leadership role to be the champion for that. What is your take on what the UK's position is in that area?
Yeah, that's a good one. I wish I had some of my colleagues here who are stationed at Space Command because they could probably talk a little bit more about that. I do know when it comes to UN and multilateral fora, I do know that one area that the UK is focusing on is sort of like the peaceful and sustainable use of space. We work with a group called the Secure World Foundation on a lot of that and ensuring that we're tackling things like space debris and all of that. But specifically around the UN resolution that you mentioned, I wish I had a better answer for you. I just don't have that depth of knowledge, but I'm happy to get back to you on that. But thank you for raising it. I think to your broader point around kind of US-UK defense collaboration, space is a key area for that. And when we have our space colleagues come over, I know that they do meet with Space Command and with leadership there and talk about sort of collaboration. We're also really interested in ways that UK space companies can collaborate with some of the major space primes that are here in Colorado and throughout the rest of the US. The UK has one area in particular that it's really a world leader, which is in small satellites. So these are kind of satellites that focus on Earth observation. So they're the kinds of satellites that you can use for weather monitoring, or they even do things like helping look at climate change, or they can even do things like track illegal shipping and pirating and the illegal trade in animals. I mean, it's kind of amazing what these satellites can do, and those have really been pioneered and perfected in the UK. And so we're looking at ways in which we can showcase that asset to kind of US companies as well. But I'm happy to follow up on that other question.
So you talked about the potential for a UK-US free trade agreement. Mm-hmm. And that there's been some tangible progress around very specific goods and services in that area. Seems like we heard more about this a few years ago than we're hearing about it now, and I'm just curious as to, it sounds like there continues to be progress in this area, and will it continue to be kind of incremental improvement, or will there be a day when there will actually be a signing of a free trade agreement between the two countries, and what do you see the prospects and time frame for that?
So it's a great question. I wish I had a magic 8-ball and I could tell you exactly how this is all going to play out. I think you're right in the sense that things have paused. I think it's, I can speak to the UK government's perspective. I don't want to speak on behalf of the American government, but I would say from a UK perspective, we are still very excited about the perspective of a free trade agreement. It's one of the reasons that people voted for Brexit. It was because the UK could finally have its own unilateral, independent trade policy. So we continue to work with the Biden administration to promote it. I think what we're hearing from them, and this is no surprise, that there are just other things on the plate right now. There are other bigger global concerns, again, like recovering from the pandemic and promoting global public health, tackling energy prices, recovering from the recession, that doing something like pursuing a free trade agreement at the moment, which is a huge amount of work, is not something that they have the bandwidth for or is not high on their priority list. Now, that's not to say that trade and investment with the UK is not on their priority list. It absolutely is, which is why we've been looking for these other areas in which we can kind of move things forward. I would hope in the next year or two that maybe we can restart negotiations in a more active way. I mean, I think what we found when we were negotiating under the Trump administration is, again, the US and the UK are some of the most developed economies in the world. And so this was really an opportunity to develop a free trade agreement that would be a gold standard going forward, right? It could be something where we really look at emerging technologies in a new way. We could have a chapter on digital trade. We're very like-minded, again, on environmental and labor standards. And a lot of countries that the US have negotiated free trade agreements with, there has been that daylight when it comes to labor and environment, and that's always been a key thorn in the back of these free trade agreements. So I think our hope is that we can move forward on it soon. I think the other half of, other side of the coin is just getting the US government on the same page.
Moving to the other side of the world, there was an Asian free trade agreement, which the US was a party to for a while and is not. Was Britain ever in the path on that? And we've had this great move in word, perhaps not in deed, about a focus on Asia. Is there any movement like that in Britain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're probably referring to TPP or CPTPP.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's all of this is alphabet soup, isn't it? So the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think under the Obama administration, the U.S. was engaged in those negotiations. I can speak about the UK side of it, which is, yes, the UK is engaging and looking at potentially joining CPTPP, which would again expand its free trade agreements hugely, if it were to agree to that. So I think they're actively exploring that and having active discussions. To your point more broadly about sort of the UK's position vis-a-vis Asia and kind of that part of the world, it is absolutely an important region for the UK. There's, like the US, there's a lot of daylight when it comes to China. And the UK has called out some of China's bad practices, whether it's around what they do with their currency, whether it's around IP, whether it's around human rights. There's some real issues. Yeah, there's a lot of issues. There are several issues there. But I think the UK sees Asia as some of its key partners. There are key kind of historic ties there for the UK. And so it's really positioning itself to be doing more with countries like India and others, because I think there's a lot of economic potential there as well.
This is a very active table.
I love it.
It's fires. On the way, one of the issues I was just hearing about is obviously Macron's State visit right now in Washington, and one of the issues he's supposedly upset with us over is Biden's infrastructure bill and the emphasis in that bill on renewables, and in this case mostly solar energy cells being manufactured only in the United States. And he called it, and I don't want to quote him, but something like, a barricade to free trade or an obstacle. I'm wondering, going back to some of your UN history and the history of the emphasis on, reducing our carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of every place else in the world, do you foresee that there's any chance that the most recent core was in Egypt, I guess, that some of these trade issues can be used to leverage what we hope is the outcome of those conferences, globally. Can we use trade? Could we come together on trade, for example, in the manufacture of solar energy or solar cells, such that, and I imagine the UK isn't very happy with us saying the same thing, that France and the UK, neither one of us would be too happy, and probably China not either, with the United States saying we're only going to buy solar cells manufactured here in the United States. So I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
I think you should start working for the British government because everything you've said is exactly what we what we believe. You know, it brings together two of our most important policy priorities, which is tackling climate and promoting free, fair, and open markets. Infrastructure, which you mentioned, is a really hard one to tackle when it comes to trade. There is, in the United States in particular, and this isn't a political comment, I think it's the same across all political parties, but there is this focus on buy America, buy locally, and I certainly understand that. But it does impede global competition in some ways, and it does impede the expertise that UK and other foreign companies can bring to the table. We have seen some progress on infrastructure in Colorado in particular. I don't know if any of you have ever taken the train to the plane, as we call it. It's the train that links Union Station in downtown Denver to the airport. This was a kind of a public-private partnership that was developed maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We were really proud because we had a British company that was part of that consortium to build that public infrastructure, but that is incredibly rare. Most public infrastructure projects, whether it's roads, trains, or even sort of renewable energy assets, it can be difficult for foreign companies to find opportunities there just because of the Buy America, whether it's legislated or whether it's just a preference to buy American or buy locally. That is a huge barrier for us. So it's something that we are actively working on because, kind of as you mentioned, I think trade and open markets are good for everybody. They bring new expertise, they bring better price and better competition into the market, but there is that political dimension to it that is kind of overlaid that makes it difficult. But again, renewable energy is an area that we would love to be doing more with the US on. The UK doesn't have a great solar expertise, as you can imagine, with the cloud cover and the rain that you get in the UK, but wind technology, hydrogen, those are huge areas of expertise for the UK, and those are areas that we would love to be doing more with the United States on. And again, going back to what I said before, we aren't going to be able to tackle these major transnational issues like climate change unless we work together. So we are absolutely like-minded in trying to kind of overcome some of those trade barriers.
Any additional questions?
Or comments too. If you disagree with anything I've said, please tell me. Yeah.
Well, I, as a comment on both the economy, free trade, as well as the environment, the big elephant in the room is China, and we just keep refusing to admit it. They agreed on the Paris Accords that they are going to do nothing for 20 years. 20 years.
Yeah.
And right now, the US and Europe combined, the amount of reduction we have is being compensated by 4x increases in China. So we're losing the battle, even though we're doing just, I won't say doing fine, but we are making progress, and China is increasing the carbon footprint at levels that we couldn't possibly reduce at the rate they're increasing. And the flip side, free trade, they have violated the World Trade Agreement over and over and over and are never held accountable for it. And I don't know what you do about that. I mean, you cannot build an electric car in China by law without buying all of the batteries in China, all of the batteries in China. And so our problem with solar cells and all that, I think we could come up with some free trade agreements with Europe on those issues, but you certainly can't include China because they've proven they will not abide by any rule that they sign. Yeah. So, and that's a comment, but it's a fact, and we keep ignoring that fact over and over. And I'm not just trying to demonize it; it's a fact, and unless it starts being addressed, I'm not sure how we can live in this world under the rules that we like to live on, at least, which is trade that you have commensurate giving. I by the way, worked in China for almost 20 years, and to this day, the products built in Colorado Springs have a 25% import duty into China. The equivalent products purchased from China in the United States have no tariff. That's right now. This is after 20 years.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, the US and the UK are very like-minded in terms of how China behaves as a global actor, right? It is a huge challenge. And it's across economy, and it's across human rights, and it's across defense, and it's across almost every pillar, right? What you said about China's contribution to climate change is absolutely accurate. I mean, climate change, again, is one of these transnational global issues that does not respect borders, and we cannot do anything to tackle it unless we do it as a global community. And if certain actors aren't behaving well, that makes it difficult for us to really have impact. China continues to use coal, and we can see, like, when we look at what the contributions to global warming are, I mean, a huge amount of it is in the energy sector. It's around countries that still are using coal, still focusing on gas and oil, and those make it really difficult. So I would say we're in complete agreement with you. I mean, your point about supply chains is very well received as well. I think it's what all developing countries are struggling with, and we saw the impacts of that during COVID, right? When we had all kinds of supply chain issues, which affected our ability as consumers to get the things that we want. And so I think, one of the areas that the US and the UK are working together on, again, is sort of making our supply chains more resilient, kind of ally shoring, as we call it. So working with allies more on supply chains, but that means, increasing our expertise in areas that China has had the expertise. And so that means, again, increasing our capabilities. And so that takes a little bit of time, but I guess I would just, echo all of the sentiments that you said, and I think they're very much shared with the British government too.
Since nobody brought this up, I'm curious about Great Britain's feelings about how long it's willing to stay engaged in Ukraine, and is there a gradual, like, the general population and the government, are you guys gonna get tired of funding this war? And what parameters do you see? I have no military background, but I have this really uncomfortable feeling that it could easily turn into a much bigger global event than just Russia trying to destroy Ukraine. So I'm just curious about, like, your government, especially your new Prime Minister, what his government thinks about commitment to Ukraine.
I would say there's really strong commitment to Ukraine at the moment. Whether or not I can predict what it's going to look like several years in the future, I personally just don't know, and I wouldn't want to speculate, but I would say in the moment there is incredibly strong commitment. Our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has been very vocal about the UK's commitment to supporting the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government. We've talked a lot about how, Russia's aggression and Russia's invasion was, premeditated, unprovoked, that it breaks international law and UN charter. And we've been pretty aggressive in trying to help Ukraine during this period of conflict. I think we've taken kind of a three-pronged approach to how we help them. And we've devoted a lot of resource to it, I think around $4 billion already to this, and it's across sanctions, as I mentioned. So the UK has enacted its most aggressive sanctions against Russia that it's ever enacted. That's kind of unilaterally and multilaterally, both against individuals that either prop up Putin or contribute to his supply chain or in any way help further this conflict. Again, we've sanctioned about 1,200 individuals and about 120 entities in Russia, which I think is having significant impact. We've also contributed from a defense perspective as well, so contributing, arms and ammunition and armored vehicles and that sort of thing. And I think the intent is to continue that as well. And then, thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we've just contributed on a humanitarian front. So whether it's food aid, medical supplies, medical aid, there's a lot that's being done. And also helping with visas for Ukraine refugees coming over to the UK. I think we've welcomed like 250,000 Ukrainian refugees into the UK. So there's significant support and significant work that's being done. Whether I can predict what that's going to look like in 5 years, I'm not sure. But what I can say now unequivocally is that the British government is absolutely supporting the Ukrainians.
This is going to follow up on the China connection. obviously the UK is closer to Europe than we are. If anything's going to happen in the China relationships, it'll obviously depend on how the rest of Europe reacts to that. What's your perspective and view of whether Europe is looking at China as a nasty player in the world of trade, et cetera, and if they're really committed to doing anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, the UK has had its issues with the EU, right? It's one of the reasons that it ended up leaving. But I would say on this particular foreign policy priority, there's a lot of overlap. I don't think there are European countries or EU countries that are thinking the way that China is behaving internationally is appropriate or good. Again, the way it behaves from an economic perspective, from a defense and military perspective, and from a human rights perspective is problematic for the values of almost all of the European countries, UK included. So I do think that policy vis-a-vis China throughout Europe and including the UK is going to be relatively aligned.
Germany in particular?
I think so. I mean, I think some of the most egregious things that China does, I can't see any developed country finding those to be okay.
Okay, so to continue down the China rabbit hole.
You know I'm not a China expert, right?
Okay, so this has to do with Taiwan, which is probably going to be a very big issue in the future. So how is the EU and British going to support us when it comes to that point in time?
Yeah, that's another one of these difficult international issues, right? I wish I could speak to exactly what UK's Taiwan policy is. It's actually an area that in this role I don't do any work in, so I'd have to talk to my colleagues in London and those stationed in Asia to get a better read on what the tea leaves say in terms of UK policy vis-a-vis Taiwan and how it will overlap with the US. So I'm happy to get back to you on that one, but I'm conscious that I don't want to kind of step outside of my swim lane too much on some of these major foreign policy topics.
Our president did.
Yeah, that's not me though.
Is the UK going to have enough heat this winter?
I mean, that was, a major concern, right? I mean, when we saw, again, the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how they destabilized energy prices and increased energy prices, the major concern that we were hearing domestically from the UK was about what does this mean for our heating? The UK is a cold country in the winter, energy is expensive, and I think what the Prime Minister has really prioritized this, and there are all kinds of different kind of economic policies that are in play. There's been a bit of a tax raise, and there's some other policies that may not have been as popular, but what they do, and what I know the Prime Minister is focused on, is making sure that the most vulnerable in particular do feel safe this winter and do have access to heat. So I don't think it's going to be an issue, but it is absolutely something that you see talked about in the papers and is something that the British public cares very deeply about. But I know the Prime Minister is tackling it and again has taken different measures to make sure that everybody is protected, including the most vulnerable.
Once again, don't want to put you in a position.
Yeah, ask me another one I can't answer.
But do you know any position that the UK currently has in regards to Putin and whether or not to try to force the international community to bring him up on criminal, warfare charges?
So I don't know the UK's official position when it comes to war crimes or the War Crimes Tribunal. I do know that the UK has been very vocal in their opposition to Putin, obviously, and his behavior and his actions vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think what we've heard, UK government officials, whether it's the foreign ministers, the prime minister, say is that it's been clear since Russia's premeditated invasion of Ukraine that they were never going to be open to a diplomatic solution. And so we're having to use other sort of levers to pressure them, whether that's sanctions, whether that's helping arm the Ukraine military, whether that's providing humanitarian aid. So again, policy as a in respect to the war crimes tribunals, I'm not sure, but I know in particular that there is a lot of harsh words being said against Putin and not a lot of confidence in his desire to want to come to the table and resolve things diplomatically.
Let's all thank Erin Kuhn for speaking with us today.